Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought. Today, we're going to have an interview with Brian Kemple. Brian is a PhD graduate of the Center for Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Texas. He writes on metaphysics, epistemology, phenomenology, and semiotics. And his website is called Continuum Philosophical Insights. And that's cp-insight.com. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. So, Isaac, why don't you start us off and help us understand, what we want to talk about with Dr. Kemple today.
Well, I've been excited about this because he's Dr. Kemple. I've been sort of monitoring you from afar just because I found you interesting. I've listened to a few of your talks. I've read a few of your blogs. I've read some sections of your recent, pretty affordable Introduction to Philosophical Principles, and I get the sense that your intent is sort of that you're trying to popularize the practical use of proper thinking and proper philosophy, rather than having it being sort of within like the ivory tower of academia. And in some contexts like Twitter, I can feel your frustration in that effort. And so how do we increase that level of dialogue and have an impact on culture and sort of improve our game there?
Yeah. Well, I think the major thing is patience, right? Which is certainly my particular struggle. So I think the virtue that I struggle the most with, and so God's been giving me plenty of opportunities over the last couple of years to practice it. What I think we really lack, though, is, like you were saying, something out in sort of outside academia, outside the ivory tower. And bringing this to people is it's a unique challenge today, in the sense that we've recently sort of, shifted technological paradigms in Western society between the sort of age of television and the age of centralized media, the age of large and, numbers of people belonging to sort of competing ideologies, the left versus right political struggle, where most of sort of our public discourse has unfolded within over the past 70 years or what have you. And we've now shifted into this sort of new digital paradigm, right? Where I wrote a piece a few months ago on called, Leaving the Global Village. How we're sort of, there's this digital diaspora from the global village that television had created, where now you've got not just two major competing ideologies, you've got this continual fragmentation into hundreds, where every new thinker who comes along proposes a new way of interpreting the world. So you end up with your Jordan Petersons and your Dave Rubins and all these sort of Ben Shapiro types who are presenting ways to think about the world that are different from the ways that have come before. And so there's just a whole lot of chaos right now. There's a lot of different ideologies, different ways of looking at the world that are being put out there. And so what's lacking from this is this sort of consistent philosophical education, an education which allows people to have the tools to interpret all these things that are being said into some sort of coherent worldview. So that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do with things like, this Introduction to Philosophical Principles and with Continuum Philosophical Insight. The Introduction to Philosophical Principles, I put it as a paperback because I know some people, myself included, prefer having a physical copy. But I also put it out for free digitally in a PDF because my intent is not to make money with it. Right? It's not exactly an easy thing to do, to make money with self-publishing books or even publishing books with large publishers. But I just want to get the ideas out there, and I want to get people talking about these things, and I want to get people trying to engage in a different way of thinking so that we can start to navigate this chaos a little bit.
Yeah, I really like that you use the term diaspora, because I think that's a very good way to describe how a lot of people feel, not only philosophically in terms of thought and ideologies, but in religion and in community. and you had sort of like one source of truth, like you described with like the TV era, where things sort of made sense based on this sort of common narrative and common cultural understanding. But with social media, it's like you've got this fracture of, you know, millions of different sort of subcultures and subcultures, and so when people are talking, it's almost as if no one's saying, not only are their definitions for words different, but so none of the words mean the same thing, the definitions aren't the same, but also they're starting from totally different frames, and it's like everyone just talks past one another. And so more specific in sort of our own circles, what do you think is the relevance and the significance of what I think you've called the philosophical habit on the life of the ideal Catholic man in this age? What's the relevance and significance of that?
I think the most relevant point in terms of developing a philosophical habit is not being swept along in currents. Right? There's, I look at the intellectual dark web thing, which is just a terrible name, I have to say. I don't know how they can use that in any sort of self-respecting sense. But anyway, I look at the things that are said there, and most of it's about this sort of call back to reason and the call away from the sort of what they call postmodern thinking. And there's not really a whole lot of substance to what most of what they're actually saying. I think when you get down to it. And I think when you lack a philosophical habit, when you lack a habit of reflecting on what terms actually mean, both those said by the people that you're listening to and those said by yourself, you can get swept up in these things which have a kind of, I guess, fitting appeal to you. Right? So if you're someone who's, say, relatively conservative compared to things like transgender, post-gender issues, and you hear someone talking about how it just doesn't make sense, right? And it's not something that should be pushed in the university, and it's something which is destructive to society, that's probably just going to immediately resonate with you, right? And for good reason. But you might not really understand why. You might not really get into the question of, okay, well, what does gender really mean? And why is it really an important thing? You're just sort of taking it at this common sense level. In other words, it's what feels comfortable to you. And you're, in that case, not standing on any firmer intellectual grounds than the people who say they don't feel comfortable with traditional concepts of gender. You're sort of just standing on equally shaky footing, even if the idea that you happen to have is one that is correct or true. If you can't explain why, if you can't put it in terms of some sort of causal explanation, then you don't really know why it's true. And so I think that's something which takes away from our essential humanity. We are creatures who desire to know by nature, as Aristotle says at the very beginning of his metaphysics. That this is what we are as human beings, is that we desire to know. That there's something about our nature which orients us towards wanting knowledge. And that's what I think that the philosophical habit that I've been stressing is all about, is how do we really develop knowledge? Not just how do we, satisfy our own ideological commitments, but how do we come to know why and whether they're true.
So interesting. Why do you think people, and I've pondered this myself, why do people seem to not be like intellectually curious? Why do they not ask why?
Well, you can point, for one thing, I think, to fallen nature. But today especially, I think there's so many opportunities for distraction. Right? We live in a culture of distraction. I think my favorite poem of any poem ever is T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. And the first is in Burnt Norton in the third section. He has that beautiful line that we're distracted from distraction by distraction, and it's true. True much more now than it was in his own day. I can't imagine what T.S. Eliot would think of Twitter. That it's real easy to get overwhelmed with information. Different, streams, whether they're through social media or more traditional news media, just reading things online, looking at things like Reddit. There's so much information that, it's much easier, as I was talking about before, to just sort of take things in stride with your already believed commitments, and to just sort of interpret them all through that framework. And just in general, the culture doesn't encourage reflection. And it doesn't encourage taking time to think about what things mean or whether or not they're true. Mm-hmm. It encourages things like making more money and, doing what pleases you, doing what makes you happy. And a large part of that has really come through the sort of, I would say, television image of things. We sort of consciously or not tend to form idealized pictures of life through television media. And we, it's not just that say we idealize the lives that we see on the screen, sort of romanticized pictures of things, whether that's from a sitcom or from a drama or what have you, but that we actually start to interpret things in terms of the kind of illusory presentation that television gives us. Through television, we're always presented with this picture, right, of how things should look. And so that's how we start to interpret the world as we encounter it. Is, okay, how would I like things to look for me? How would I like my life to look? Rather than trying to understand how things actually are around us, we try to change things around us to fit that idealized image. So this is a very deeply seated habit in our culture, I think, to sort of try and shape the world into our ideal pictures of things.
It was interesting you mentioned what was called the intellectual dark web, which, I mean, it's much more apt to call it the intellectual dork web, because it's not, these people are vanilla, sort of run-of-the-mill, sort of neoliberal types, and I'm just wondering, it baffles me to see this presented as some sort of like edgy, and so it all seemed kind of goofy, and nonetheless, they some of them do some pretty interesting work in some areas. Like Quillette has occasionally some okay stuff,
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like that's almost the sort of the neoliberal attempt to sort of save the liberal ideology from its own atomization, because it's so scattered and fragmented, with the assistance of technology and everything. It seems like it's scattered things so much that it's trying to sort of bring it back away from sort of the mob rule that's led to sort of, what they decry as for sort of like on-campus censorship and, wrongthink and these sorts of things. And so it's almost like a neoliberal attempt to save itself.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of funny that you bring this up. To just sort of put in a little pitch for myself here, a little plug for myself, rather. I just submitted the draft of an article to Chris DeGroot's website, The Agonist. Actually, strictly on this issue, on the sort of problems with this neoliberal, neo-enlightenment kind of movement that you find in places like Quillette and ArcDigital, and my favorite to hate on Aereo magazine. On how, yes, this is absolutely, in some cases, unabashedly an attempt to preserve the sort of neoliberal ideology. Aereo magazine has this manifesto against the enemies of modernity. It's like, this 15,000 word or whatever essay written by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, which lays out very clearly the sort of editorial direction that Aereo has taken itself in. And it's not as explicit, but I think that's shared in some regard or another by Quillette and a few other outlets here and there. Absolutely, what they're trying to do is sort of preserve themselves, and they're doing this in accordance with very much an Enlightenment mentality. Christopher Dawson has some wonderful things written on the Enlightenment. Historian, a very philosophical historian for anyone who might not be familiar with him. He was the chair of Roman Catholic Studies at Harvard University in, I believe, the 1950s. I think he might have been the only chair of Roman Catholic Studies. I think they may have shut that down after he departed. At any rate, he describes the Enlightenment as the sort of combination of the empirical methodology that was rooted in Locke and Hume, with the rationalistic faith, so to speak, of Descartes, that faith in the supremacy of reason, our reason to figure things out, and especially through the application of something like a scientific method. So what's happened with these sorts of outlets, broadly, I think you could just sort of call them modernist outlets, is, they have a sort of worship of a vague sense of reason, a vague god of reason, of human reason. And there's very little discussion on any of their sites, on any of their articles, and any of their writings that I could find as to what reason actually is, or to what shape reason actually takes. There's no discussion of how it proceeds through human operations or human faculties. There's simply this sort of scientific methodology, and oftentimes that involves including things in terms of imperiometric measures, empirical quantitative measures. So they're trying to hold things together against the sort of so-called postmodern ideologies, but I think when you actually trace it all out, when you trace out the history of these ideas, the theories of the Enlightenment, or the beliefs of the Enlightenment, have actually led to those postmodern ideologies. The postmodern ideologies are just taking to the logical conclusion the principles that you find in Enlightenment thinking.
Absolutely.
So, you're just, this attempt to bring things back or whatever to a point of sanity, you're really just trying to get back to the roots of the problem. And you're just going to continue, developing in that direction if you return to the same roots. So it's this sort of self-defeating and often self-aggrandizing task that they've set themselves up for, I think.
So I wanted to jump in real quick on one of the things you said. So you're kind of talking about how it seems like they want to go back to something, and mm-hmm. So I find it funny how there's this idea that they're that certain groups of people are quote unquote conservative, especially the IDW types, and so and intellectual dark web. So all of a sudden they're conservative because they want to drive off the cliff at 50 miles an hour rather than 150 miles an hour. And so it reminds me of Robert Conquest's 3 Laws of Politics. And the first one is everyone is a conservative about what he knows best. So it seems like, because these people are sort of academic philosophers or whatever, and because they have this liberal bent, they're like, okay, well, we have to preserve, my point of view on this thing, but everything else can just go off the rails, whatever.
Oh yeah, that's quite accurate, I think. And I think part of what ties into this, to sort of bring it back a little bit, to bring some threads together here, is that there really isn't a whole lot of admiration for philosophy among these groups. I'll throw a little bit of a tip of the hat to Arc Digital in that they do at least have a section of essays on their site, which is labeled philosophy. Although I think it would be better labeled something like miscellaneous cultural commentary, occasionally taken from a slightly philosophical point of view. There is some good stuff on there. There are some good authors, John Barnhart, I think Oliver Traldi has written a few things. And the same thing with Quillette, they don't have any section of philosophy, and if you look for things explicitly philosophical on their site, you're not going to find much. But there are some good people who write there. Ben Sixsmith is a good writer. Some good stuff up there on occasion. And even Area Magazine, I was looking through their site the other day, and I found something that was talking about Joseph Pieper and the liberal arts. I'm like, wow, that's surprising and good. But yeah, they're really not concerned with philosophy except at the most superficial levels. They might admire something like the political philosophy of sort of liberal order of things, right? Like John Locke and oftentimes sickeningly to me, Rousseau. But I don't think there's a whole lot of emphasis on investigating the principles on which they sort of built their cultural edifice. They don't want to see what the foundations really are and whether or not they really hold up. They want to take it as self-evident, that this is a good way of enduring life, of going through life. I don't know what else to say about that at the moment.
Yeah, I think the IDW types, they tend to appeal to something that you really can't defend with any kind of solid roots or anything. I remember a Jordan B. Peterson thing where he began to appeal emotionally to the individual, and as if the individual or the collective itself was supposedly some base on which you could really ground like a hardcore philosophical defense of a conception of society or of a set of ideas. And because those things alone, the individual and the collective they're always in a cooperative. And if you set them against one another, you sort of repeat the mistakes of the progression of sort of the Enlightenment philosophy. And that's a good transition, because we started out talking about how, in the general population, there's sort of a dearth of good thought, of good philosophical thinking, of intellectual curiosity. But I wonder, is that more the case in a more damning way in the academic realm than it is even in the lay realm?
Is what more damning?
The lack of real intellectual curiosity, the use of knowledge as sort of like a means, a weapon, or something that you sort of weaponize to achieve a political aim or to signal to your tribe and whatnot, as opposed to a genuine intellectual curiosity and a desire to teach in a real sense.
Yeah, academia it's like anything else; it's a mixed bag. I think there definitely are. And this might be more particular to my own experience, having spent most of my academic time in and around Catholic academia. I went to a Catholic undergraduate institution, Catholic graduate school. Most of the people I know in academia are in, or at least have spent a significant amount of time around Catholic academia. And so there are probably a higher percentage, I would say, of people who are genuinely intellectually curious in those realms. In the broader, academic worlds, there are still a lot of people who are legitimately intellectually curious. The problem is that the structure of academia is stifling to that. I don't know how much experience Levi has had with this, but the publish to perish or publish or perish mentality, the pursuit of tenure track, the pursuit of prestige, right, becomes this overwhelming concern, not even consciously, right, but little bit by little bit as you sort of struggle through your career, trying to get jobs, trying to get the right appointments, get to know the right people, you become sort of unconsciously enslaved towards this pursuit of prestige.
And what actually brought you to my attention was when I first saw you engage someone who is an anonymous account online who will remain nameless, who after some engagement with them, it was clear they were more interested in appearing right and sort of getting these accolades drawn to them rather than and you were like, well, honestly, I'm going to stop this right here because it's clear you're not reading the terms nor the context of Thomas or Pierce properly.
Yeah, I think I remember that exchange. That was interesting. No, I mean that's absolutely the case that you're going to find, particularly when you find people in sort of like these interdisciplinary things who think they know something about everything. When they don't seem to even know much about their particular specialty when it gets right down to it. There's, not to get too particular, but I believe that person is a graduate student, and a graduate student with a very high opinion of the programs that that person has been in, which sort of inflates that sense of prestige and that sense of ego, right? Oh, I've gone to these schools, or I go to Harvard or something like that. I spent a year and a half or so living in Boston after I graduated with my PhD, and boy, you walk around Cambridge, Massachusetts, you can hear people in conversations, talk to people at bars or academic conferences, and you're not going to find a group of people more full of themselves. But I'm not being facetious in the least when I say that I wasn't impressed by pretty much any of them. Their depth of knowledge is rather superficial. And I think that's become part of our academic culture in general, right, is that it's not very discerning anymore. The biggest factor in getting a PhD is not intelligence. The biggest factor is stick-to-itiveness. Right? If you can endure the process of studying, which isn't to say this is universally the case in all programs in all schools, but somewhere you can find a school that will grant you a PhD as long as you're bullheaded enough to continue through the program. And so that's led to a sort of glut of underqualified, in terms of real intellectual capacity, underqualified PhDs that are out there in the world. So you have a lot of people who wear the clothes of the intellectual but don't have the substance of it.
Right. It seems like these types of people have a sort of scent to me. It's like this, they want this sort of expert status because they believe they've sort of clawed their way to this high ground and over their dead body kind of thing. Are you going to take it from them? Whereas if you really step back and look at that seems like such a small way to act. And when I asked you the question about sort of the ideal Catholic man, it's because I think that there's a whole patrimony of philosophy, meaning, like an inheritance that men and women who are Catholic and who are human have this great patrimony of philosophy, of history, and these things that we can learn from and become better from. And it seems so much smaller to try to use that as some badge of, status or symbol kind of thing.
Yeah. There's a great article written probably about 15, 20 years ago by, maybe not quite that old, I'm not sure, Father Joseph Koterski. He's taught at Fordham University for many years. It's an article titled "In Defense of Authority," and he talks about the need for a legitimate sense of authority and how there's this ironic, frequent occurrence in the university where academics will talk about the fallacy of an appeal to authority while they're all rushing to become authorities themselves. They say it's the weakest of argument, and oh, by the way, I know this because I'm a great authority on it. And in the article, he goes on to explain that the real merit to authority is that it's attaining a connection with a truth higher than oneself. Right? That authority isn't about what you possess in yourself; it's that you have the knowledge of these things outside of yourself. And so you talk about the patrimony of the tradition in philosophy. That's something that you're not going to find in most universities. If you look at most analytic philosophy, which is the majority of philosophy in the United States as it's taught in the university, there's very little investigation into thinkers before, say, the late 19th century. There's very little consideration of the history. Most of it's debate over contemporary issues. And so you get these really, really terrible tri-point papers that are talking about things of a very ephemeral relevance. That there's not really looking for truths greater than oneself. There's this attempt to show one's own intelligence, really, is most of what's going on in contemporary philosophy.
That's interesting. I find it fascinating. You've started sort of a philosophical practice, and is there sort of something that led you outside of the traditional academic route? Is there some sort of experience or something that led you to see that, hey, maybe these things should be popularized, that this should be much more of a practical or an art that rather than just something that's sort of up high?
Right. Well, I had sort of a confluence of different things. For one thing, when I finished my PhD, I'd been on the job market for a little while and just wasn't having any luck. I think all told, over 2.5 or so years on the job market, I put in applications for 127 different academic positions.
Mm-hmm.
And putting in a job application for an academic position isn't quite like putting one in for your non-academic job. There's a lot more involved. You usually have to write statements of intent and commitment to mission statement, and put together a sample of your teaching evaluations and all these other things. So it's a rather involved process. So I think out of that, I got maybe 3-4 interviews, something like that. And it just, I kept getting passed over. And so there's certainly a particular frustration with that. At the same time, while I was in Boston, I was teaching as an adjunct at Wentworth Institute of Technology. And I was doing a lot of private tutoring at the time because students in Boston tend to come from wealthier families who have a lot of money that they're willing to spend on a private tutor. You can actually make better money that way, I think, than most teaching positions. So I was doing that, and some of the students that I gained in the process, started to tell me that they found my tutoring more informative than the classes that they were taking. And they found it, it was a better way of presenting things, a better way of going about the issues. And so I thought, okay, maybe I can take this and do something like this on a larger scale. Maybe I can take something like one-on-one individual education. There's one client in particular that I still have to this day. He was doing a doctorate in business administration and has since switched over to a PhD in business. There was a philosophical component to his coursework, and he found what I was doing so much more helpful than the professor that it just sort of blossomed into this thing where not only was I helping him with his coursework, but he wanted philosophical education outside of that. And so I figured, well, there have to be more people like this out in the world who can afford to do it in this sort of manner, who can pay a reasonable amount for the sort of level of expertise that I have. But I also want to bring it to people who can't afford that. Right? So that's why I'm trying to offer seminars and maybe some courses. Still sort of working out some of the details with that. But I just ran a poll on Twitter this past day on what people would like to have for a seminar, and it's gotten some pretty good response. So I might have 2 this summer, at a discount rate, since it's the first time I'm trying this. So I'm sure there'll be some kinks that need to be worked out. I thought that as I started this idea, as this idea started to grow, I realized just more and more how necessary it is. Used to interacting with people on Twitter who, for one reason or another, have not received a good philosophical education, whether it's because college is too expensive or the colleges that they've gone to haven't provided that. I see that there's a kind of hunger for it. People want this sort of service, and it's not being offered to them, right? And instead, they're turning to these, sort of flash in the pan, anonymous figures as intellectual leaders. And I think that's not only is it not the best sort of education that they could get, it's perhaps dangerous in some cases, right? Then you get a kind of cult of personality around these figures online who don't really know in great depth what they're talking about, right? They can be misleading at times. And they can, take what, say Aquinas says on some issue that was a contingent particular issue in his own time, and misapply that as though it's still perfectly the way things should operate today.
Here's where St. Thomas was a communist.
Right. Here's where St. Thomas was a communist, or here's where St. Thomas said that, we should banish and subjugate all the Jews, right? It's going to go one extreme or the other, and not pay attention to the particular historical context in which that statement was made. And so, I think there's dangers on every side of the spectrum there, that anyone can go and read Thomas Aquinas's works. Most of them are translated into English. Most all of them are available on the Dominican House of Studies Priory website. It's a great resource, but just because you can read the literal words doesn't mean that you have the philosophical acumen to understand them. It's a difficult thing to understand Thomas Aquinas, and I don't recommend for most individuals to just go off on their own and read him. I think it's much better if you can read him with people who've been educated in Thomistic philosophy, just because there's so many things that you could misinterpret from something that was written, in Latin 700 plus years ago.
Sure. So what do you think are the sort of the most dangerous errors, or perhaps the most hindering errors that we commit in our thought life? And how do you sort of guard against those or ameliorate them?
Well, I think arrogant certainty, for one thing, is the biggest danger, right? That I'm right, I know what I'm talking about, and you're a stupid idiot, and you're speaking out the wrong end. I think that's the easiest one to fall into, and especially with the sort of extreme contentious nature of digital life, as it were, where you're most talking to a picture that you've never talked to in real life and never seen in real life. It's the same sort of factor in road rage, right? That when it's a semi-anonymous person, it's very easy to treat them very, very negatively. And so, in parallel to that sort of arrogance, I think complacency, which goes hand in hand, thinking that you know enough, that you've mastered some subject. I've been, to give just a very brief example from my own life, I've been, reading Thomas Aquinas in serious academic studies since, before I went to college, but certainly 2006 and on. And I still go back to the basic texts time to time and, find something new, find something I didn't understand there. I find someone else's interpretation, which illuminates something that I thought I knew better than I thought I knew it. And so there's just always more, right? We can't be complacent. We can't sort of say, okay, well, I know enough. You never know enough. And there's always something more and something better that you could pursue in your knowledge.
So I started to read a little bit of your introduction, and it's actually quite readable. I like how it presents things, and I've read some sort of introductory philosophical manuals that were sort of intended for the 19th century. So they're fairly rigorous and very systematized and almost very dry. But I think yours reads well. Is there any set of works or like sort of a starting point you'd recommend for someone who wants to go into sort of this philosophical inheritance that Catholicism has?
I don't know that I have something off the top of my head. I think in some sense, if you're really just starting out, if you've never really engaged in any sort of study at all, I think Chesterton is actually a good introduction, just in the sense of the way that he sort of challenges presuppositions with his quasi-paradoxical view of things. But beyond that, it's not that there's not one good thing to read. It's that there's so many, right?
Sure.
Joseph Pieper is a great introductory read, I think. He's got several works, Leisure, The Basis of Culture, In Defense of Philosophy, The Philosophical Act. His treatment of the virtues is very good. And then there are some works, say, of Jacques Maritain, which might be a little bit more approachable, something like Person and the Common Good. Let's see. I'm turning around and looking at the bookshelf at the moment, trying to see if anything's jumping out to me. There's lots and lots of different ways that you can get into it. And of course, there's always my own book, too.
Certainly.
And that's kind of part of what I had in mind when I wrote it, right? Is that most of the books that we have that are out there, especially recent ones, are geared towards the classroom setting. They're geared towards use in a university where you're at least somewhat surrounded by this kind of life, this sort of philosophical life, at least, ideally. But that's not the case for a lot of people, right? We're sort of far-flung throughout the country, in different stages of our lives. And so it's not easy for people to find, an environment of philosophical speculation, of philosophical thinking. So that's kind of what I had in mind in writing a book is, okay, let me write a book for those people, for the people who are on an intellectual island, who want to get into these issues. And it's the same thing with, ideally with Continuum Philosophical Insight, with seminars and classes. It's, okay, here's something that I can do online where I can provide this sort of environment for people who want it, who can't get to it regularly in their own physical surroundings.
Sure. You mentioned G.K. Chesterton. What do you think of, have you read his book, St. Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah, it's honestly been quite a number of years, but I probably read it at least twice, if not a third time. It's one of those biographies that's mixed with a fair amount of legend and a fair amount of
sure.
his own interpretation, but I think it's it's faithful nonetheless to the spirit of his life and faithful to the spirit of his writing. I think it might treat the issue of being a little bit simplistically, but that's a debate that I've sort of written on for many years, and so I
felt it was interesting for painting an interesting picture of St. Thomas Aquinas, but with G.K. Chesterton, you have to worry about, because there's a lot of flourish in the way that he can build a narrative and a story, and I kind of wondered how much the flourish sort of reflected the reality.
Yeah, I think the way to look at that is that the flourish is for us, less than it is about him, less than it is about Aquinas. It's something which helps bring us into reading about it and thinking about Aquinas' life and his works. But you might want to balance that out with maybe a bit more tempered of a biography. So again, to bring up Joseph Pieper, he has a short book, The Silence of St. Thomas, which I think sort of balances out a bit of what you find in Chesterton. So probably maybe read both of those. If you're going to read one, maybe read the other.
Alrighty. Well, Levi, do you have any other questions for Dr. Kemple?
Yeah. So I guess my one other question would be, what kinds of things do you plan on offering? Are you planning on expanding Continuum Philosophical Insights to other types of educational events, or do you have any books planned for the future? Or, I mean, I know you're promoting the one, and we're going to put a link to your book right now, but that you have out right now. But what other things are coming on the horizon for you?
Well, I definitely do have a plan to publish more, probably in line with maybe some of the courses and seminars that I'll offer. Definitely I have one planned already on metaphysics. I've got a lot of old notes from classes and things and writings that I've done that are sort of I'm going to pull together and expand on and offer that as a book on metaphysics. I'll probably intend some point to offering one which gets into philosophical psychology a bit deeper, maybe something on semiotics, maybe something on phenomenology. I have no shortage of plans for things to write. But as far as other events, definitely, I intend to make a career out of this if I really can. So to do in-person seminars, if possible, maybe give talks if people are willing to have me. And it may not always be just me. I know there are other academics, other philosophers who have been struggling with the job market, who have great talent and great philosophical insight. And so if I can, get this off the ground, I'd be very happy to bring other people in. I only have so much expertise as a philosopher. I think I know a good amount of things about a good amount of topics, but there are other people who know a lot more about a lot more. So there's no reason not to bring them in as well. So I think it's starting to pick up some steam here, and things are looking up.
That's good. Well, thanks for joining us today. I appreciate Isaac jumping on to ask lots of great questions, and thank you, Dr. Kemple, for joining us.
All right, well, thank you guys. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing this out there.
Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.